Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. If you've been thinking it might be a good idea to build an ark over the last few weeks, stay tuned. Irving Finkel of the British Museum has a set of instructions translated from a Babylonian clay tablet that predates Genesis by over 1,000 years. The good news, you won't need to find a source of gopher wood, but you are going to end up with the biggest coracle ever built. Also with us today is the writer Hattie Naylor, whose play Going Dark temporarily deprives the audience of eyesight so that they can better understand the experience of a man going blind. And the neuroscientist Professor Colin Blakemore, here to talk about the reliability of our senses and their unexpected interactions. As well as all that expertise, we have an expert on experts too, the sociologist Harry Collins, whose new book argues that we just don't take scientists seriously enough anymore. We're going to start, though, with a small clay tablet about the size of a mobile phone and covered with cuneiform writing. Irving Finkel, you very kindly brought in a replica of this. To an untrained eye, it looks pretty much like any other Babylonian clay tablet. It is a closed book if you don't read cuneiform. When it was brought to you at the British Museum, you knew pretty quickly that it was something special. How did it come to you?
When I first saw it, I thought it was a letter, because it's a very conventional looking, fit in the hand kind of tablet in normal kind of writing, and I thought it was a letter. So I picked it up expecting to say, to Mr. So-and-so, and it started off, wall, read wall. And those words, to an Assyriologist, are a red rag to several bulls, because it's part of the most famous literature, the flood story, and it's the very moment when the god Enki in heaven tells Atrahasis, who's the equivalent of Noah, that he's got to build this boat, otherwise there's
it's
trouble.
A recognisable invocation to a famous story.
Absolutely.
In your book, The Ark Before Noah, which is all about this tablet and its implications, you write about an earlier keeper at the British Museum who was so excited when he got the Noah story. He took all of his clothes off immediately.
He did. I think there's been an expectation in the British Museum ever since that if you make a really good discovery, you at least get down to your underclothes.
You didn't take your clothes off and you're fully dressed now, but you do convey the excitement. Your book very charmingly keeps going into italics. You say that cuneiform is the most interesting kind of writing. It is much more fun than any alphabet.
When I was at school, people said you mustn't use italics. You're a poor writer if you do. You have nothing in the words that commands attention. Well, I've discovered, having reached the age of 62, that in point of fact, when people read English, they don't read intelligently. And if you put something in italics, they know that's the bit they have to make attention to. I think it's a useful device.
Well, I was very struck by you saying it was much more fun, because you talk about the difficulties of deciphering it. Interesting, yes. Challenging, yes. But fun, it is enormously difficult, isn't it? Just explain some of the difficulties.
It's enormously difficult for about a decade. Once you're involved with it, once you feel where you are, you know the parameters of your world, it does become fun. What is fun in the real sense is, firstly, reading something that no one's read before, because that's always an adventure. And the other thing is finding something totally unexpected coming out of a tablet which looks like a normal tablet. And this was the most extreme case, because no one would have known how much marvellous stuff was concealed in those wedges.
Okay.
That's really good fun.
Well, tell us what you discovered.
Well,
what was the surprise?
The really main thing is this, that the boat that was supposed to be built, the lifeboat to rescue the life on the earth before the waters, was a round craft. And people know what Noah's Ark looks like. It's a kind of little boat with a house in the middle, or in the Bible it's a kind of oblong vessel, and nobody, I don't think, had ever thought of the idea it might be round. But in this tablet it's very clear that the Babylonians in about 1750 BC, that's how they conceived of it. And it's a very rational thing, because they had these coracles, these normal round boats that you even find in the British Isles, on the rivers, the Euphrates and Tigris, as their normal taxi service. They were small and you could manoeuvre them quickly. And it makes sense that the poet who wrote this story, and accounting for the boat that was going to rescue everything, would build the biggest coracle ever made, which would never sink. It would just bob around safely with all the animals mooing and so forth inside until the water went down. Then it would land and they'd all just board and start breeding like crazy. You
have pictures of kind of relatively modern coracles. I mean, they've gone out of use on the Euphrates now, but
yes.
They can carry 15 to 20 people.
Yes, they don't look very happy in the photograph, but you can get a lot of people into a coracle.
Now, the interesting thing was you did some research on the mathematics of this, and they hadn't just come up with the numbers at random, just to sound...
No.
Make it really huge.
Exactly, because in a myth like this, you'd expect someone to say the biggest coracle ever seen and all that kind of thing. But what they actually did was to give the dimensions and the size, the area of the base of this coracle is about half the size of a football pitch. And the coracle was to be made out of coiled rope with wooden ribs inside and then bitumen all round it. And what's given here in the form of instruction from God to man is the quantities that will be needed in order to make the craft function. And this is a remarkable thing because, for example, the length of rope needed to make this great basket would stretch from London to Edinburgh. So that's quite a bit of rope. And it turns out, now I could never have done this, I admit this freely in my book, there's my friend Mark who worked all this maths out, that in fact these figures are relative one to another, sensible and practical, in fact buildable.
Just before we open it out, I want to ask you, it clearly had an implication when George Smith found this tablet for the first time, because suddenly this biblical story, this yes. which biblical literalists would take as flat truth, had an earlier example.
Yeah.
Well, how did the Victorians take it? Did it shake
there were
their
a lot
faith
of distressed clergymen. I think many of them motored to the coast and looked longingly over the cliffs because no one could quite understand how Holy Writ could appear on this lump of Weetabix kind of thing. And there was a lot of argy-bargy about it. And in fact, many of the big questions have never really been addressed because it's such a loaded thing. But the principal matter, the crucial matter, was that the version of the story found by Smith, which was in the Gilgamesh account, the famous Gilgamesh version, runs so parallel to the Hebrew text of Genesis that no one could say they were unconnected. So this was a big problem. And in fact, one of the issues that they thought about was which came first, because obviously that's the telling thing. What's happened since in the intervening decades and culminating in this most recent piece is that we can see that the flood story in all its detail was up and running a good 1,000 years before the Bible, however early you wanted to date it, can have come into existence.
And your theory is that it's another... It confirms another Bible story, which is the captivity in Babylon and the fact that Jewish scribes are then learning cuneiform and learning to write in Assyrian. And
yes, I think that's an inevitable conclusion, especially when the Bible tells us so clearly in the book of Daniel that they collected all the bright, young, intelligent people, which is what you have to be an Assyriologist, and they took them into the palace and they taught them to read and write cuneiform. And that, I think, was the conduit which enabled the story to move from one literature to another.
Harry Collins, an expert in cuneiform, is presumably pretty immune to most of your external criticism, isn't it?
Well, I was hoping to say that, since my book, as you say, tries to raise the status of experts, but I'm going to shoot myself in the foot, because never having looked at a cuneiform tablet or ever having seen one before...
I'm sorry to hear that. I really am.
I think you've got a bit wrong.
You're a brave man. You're either a brave or a foolhardy man, but go on, explain.
Exactly. Well, this is the thing that puzzles me. How do you waterproof a coracle? How do you waterproof the outside of a coracle? You turn it upside down. Now, how do you turn upside down a coracle that's half the size of a football pitch?
OK. Let me remind you of something very significant, that we're dealing here with a myth.
Yep.
So in my view, those sorts of nasty, low, practical questions from reasonable people have no place whatsoever.
Well, I'm trying to do a bit of your translation for you, because in your book you say there's a word, on page 181 of the book, you say there's a word that you don't understand, this thing that you translate as roller.
Yes.
But I think it's got to be some device for the person waterproofing the outside of the coracle to crawl underneath it in the way you crawl underneath the carpet. I didn't
understand that. I said I did understand it for the first time. Because in the old days, people thought that the Babylonian version had rollers on which the craft was taken into the water. This is absurd. But there is good evidence from anthropological sources in Iraq that when you make a coracle, they use a roller, like the sort of thing you use on wallpaper, to smooth the surface over. And there are even photographs of these rollers in existence. So I stand by it.
You stand by that
one of your set of one of the set of italics I liked the most in your book was the world's most beautiful dictionary definition.
Yes.
And this occurred when you found a word that you'd not read
it's a
before, it was an
very rare
unusual word.
You see, what happens when you read these things is, unless you know all the words by heart, which of course I don't, you transliterate the signs and then you see how they make words. And at the beginning of this particular line, there were two signs, slightly broken, one of which read Shah and the other of which read Na. So I couldn't think what it was. So I got the Sheen volume out of the wall, because the Assyrian dictionary is about 100 feet long, and you look up the Shah part, I find the word Shana, and it says 2 by 2. So I literally nearly fell off the chair, because I couldn't have imagined that would happen. And it's a really rare word, and it's only otherwise attested with something to do with shoes, where it's clear that it means 2 by 2 in pairs.
Can you be sure you're not, because it's very difficult to read this.
Of course I can be sure I'm an expert. What do you mean?
I wondered, Colin Blakemore, whether you there's this difficult business of seeing what you want to see sometimes, isn't there? That's what. How do you guard yourself against that?
Well, particularly looking at this wonderful object that Harry's brought in, this simulation. I mean, it looks like a piece of clay that's been rolled over pebbles to me. There's no sign of any writing on it to me. I'm just in awe of the possibility of actually extracting information from this. And while it might be difficult when you've got your huge dictionary in which you can look things up, how much more difficult was it for the people who first started to read cuneiform?
Well, right at the beginning, it was disastrous. They didn't even know that it was writing. They thought it was some kind of decorative thing. But what happened was this. Two important things happened. One was they found wall sculptures where the signs of were used to write inscription in very large scale signs, very clear. So they knew straight away that it was writing. And then gradually there was a decipherment, like with the Rosetta Stone, because there was a bilingual where one side could be read and the other side could be prized open. It was marvellous.
Hattie, Naylor.
I do quite a lot of classics for radio in particular, and for theatre, and you when you read quite a few of them, like I've just done Pepys's Diaries for Radio 4, and it isn't particularly beautiful, Pepys's diary. It's a diary. It's very practical. And what really strikes me, coming from a writer's perspective, is that how beautiful the text is. And you quoted the wall at the beginning, and when I read this, for a writer anyway, it's really exciting. And I just want to read a section of it, because I think it's so beautiful, and also not what you expect to hear. And, when you're writing particularly drama, you're trying to write something that people don't expect to hear, and that's what keeps people's attention. And it begins like this: wall, read wall, Atra Hassis, pay heed to my advice, that you may live forever, destroy your house, build a boat, spurn possessions, and save life. And it's beautiful.
Your theory is that this was a kind of aid memoir for an oral narrative.
I think so. I think the reason I think so is because in the text there is no linking material. There's no so-and-so went into the palace and blew his nose. Nobody says so-and-so opened his mouth and spoke. And you always find that in Babylonian literature. All we have here is the kind of systema verba of the various people who are involved, the god and Atra Hassis. And I think it derives from something almost beyond our reach. There's one little window of it that we know in Mesopotamia, that literature began as an oral matter where people travelled around villages, and probably for a seat by the fire and a mess of pottage, they recited these stories. And
with these weighing down their down their clothes.
Very possibly. But what's interesting here is that the bit that's given in here for the benefit of a reciter is the technical data, which he might not otherwise have had.
He wouldn't otherwise remember. We're going to move on to technical data with you, Harry Collins. You're right, you have shot yourself in the foot, because your book, Are We All Scientific Experts Now, doesn't say cuneiform experts, so you're maybe off the hook on that, is about the death of deference towards scientists. You asked that question, are we all scientific experts now? I don't want to be accused of giving away a spoiler, but your answer is no. In one sense, that's obvious. Why does it need saying again?
Well, partly it needs saying again because there's certainly a lot of my colleagues in the social sciences who have a professional interest in saying that we are all scientific experts, that the public, in many respects, have as much right to an opinion on various technical matters, such as the safety of vaccinations or climate change or things like this, as the experts. And this really worries me, because it seems to me that if you project forward a little bit, to the point where none of us are taking the notion of expert seriously any longer, and you can see it beginning to catch on in the public sphere.
Happened this morning. Eric Pickles was having a go at the experts.
Well, I don't want to live in that kind of dystopia where everybody's opinion is as good as anybody else's. I mean, for one thing, I wouldn't have a job. For another thing, if I, instead of getting invited to pleasant seminars all over the place, they just invite the first person walking in the street to give the paper instead of me, because everybody's an expert.
Or the person whose Facebook entry gets the most likes. I mean, it's partly that democratisation of comment, isn't it, that scientists have to expose themselves to the commentary of anybody who wants to comment.
Exactly. It's dangerous, it's frightening, and of course it would be absolutely horrible, because then the society you lived in would be all about power, or the power of publicity, or something like that.
Is there a degree of apologia in this book? Because you describe the stages of attitudes towards science, beginning with the Festival of Britain you start with, where, you know, you've got the white heat of technology, everybody looks up to the white-coated magus, and then slowly it decays. And sociology is one of the disciplines that eats into that, because it comes along and it sort of says, well, actually, even a fact is culturally conditioned. The French take this to absolutely extreme lengths. But even here, there's a sort of sense that it all comes out of culture, and so everything is questionable. And that comes from sociology, doesn't it?
Sociology and the much broader movement called postmodernism. I would say that the more wild bits of it come more from semiotics, more from the literary end than from the sociological end. I mean, I was one of the founders of this movement, but the small group of people who started doing it, we were all either scientists, not me, but or sort of quasi-scientists, people who felt that they had to learn the science before they started criticising it. And it was a small group and a fairly esoteric group, and not many people knew much about us. But it's when semiotics decided that really what science was just the production of papers and the production of literary artefacts that it all went completely crazy. And so it's a kind of apology for my profession, but not an apology in the other way, because I don't think anything I'm writing is incompatible with what we did in the 70s.
I was just going to say, you're not saying that it's untrue to say that science is very often compromised, involves personalities, but that the public don't fully understand the way in which that works. So when they see, as it were, scientists, I'm going to use the word fudging now, which isn't exactly the right word, but when they see scientists compromising on what their imagination of pure scientific truth is, they think they're cheats. And in fact, that's not the case. They're just scientists.
Well, there are two things going on. There's what you've just pointed out, that it's, and I think we all made this mistake in the 70s, when we discovered, when we took our tape recorders into scientific laboratories and we found scientists slagging their colleagues off, just like ordinary people. We thought, this is a great discovery. Scientists are ordinary. But when you start thinking about it a bit, that doesn't make them ordinary. It means that they're struggling with a more difficult problem than the old-fashioned 1950s philosophy of science thought they were, where everything was clear-cut. You did an experiment, you replicated it, it either proved it or it disproved it. It isn't like that at all. Scientists are always disagreeing with whether somebody's done the replication correctly, and then the replicator says to the person who first did it, no, it's you did it wrong, I've got it right. And it's very much like ordinary life. But actually, just the fact that it's like ordinary life doesn't make science wrong, it makes it hard. And so that the true outcome of the sociology is that, science is just a lot harder than we thought. Now, it's also the case, and this isn't due to this, it's not the sociologists who've found this, it's journalists, it's historians and it's various other people, that there's a lot of scientists out there, or a number of scientists out there who cheat. I mean, that's a different phenomenon. That's not part of the nature of science, that's just people being corrupt. Being corrupt. And the mistake is to think that because there are some corrupt scientists, then science is a profession like any other corrupt profession. But that's the wrong conclusion to draw. If somebody wants an honest person, you don't say to them, well, go among bankers. That's where you'll find honest people. You say, you're more likely to say, I hope, go among scientists, because the norms of science are still telling scientists to be honest and straight.
Colin Blakemore, I don't think you're going to disagree with that, but do you share the anxiety about public attitudes?
I think the anxiety I would have is about the changing relationship between science and the public, and the recognition that science is a public enterprise and it's on behalf of people, and therefore, it's their money after all. Most science is done in money which either is derived from from public sources or comes through, commercial activity, which therefore is indirectly funded by the public. So they are our paymasters, and we have a duty and a responsibility to report, as it were, not only the products of our activities, but how we achieve them. Harry's absolutely right. I mean, maybe scientists are human beings, and there are two sorts of mistake, if you like, that scientists can make. Mistakes which are genuine cheating, and I fear that a lot of that does go on. And the other is just the fallibility of human nature, which attaches you to the things that you believe in. So the way that scientific results are presented is often in hyperbolic terms, and perhaps overinflating the power of the evidence which is generated. And the problem of science, in the end, the business of science is to sort out amongst a mass of different opinions and a range of evidence what is the most likely direction towards truth. Not absolute truth. There are no absolute truths in science.
No, but there is, one of the great abiding problems now is that a lot of members of the public don't know the difference between an anecdote and a fact. And very often, and this occurred in MMR, it occurs with climate change, that somebody will say, well, I'm absolutely convinced this happened to me, and the jab happened and then this happened. That's not part of scientific procedure, is it?
No, the tiny thing that Colin said that I want to disagree with, when he said that the reason for some of the problems in science is human fallibility. I think that's true of the cheating, but I think that the other kind of opinion-forming aspect of science, which he said it is not a matter of human fallibility. It's just that's how it is. Unfortunately, there isn't this logical recipe that you can impose on the world that produces the facts. It is opinion-forming. It's just that scientists do it in a better and more careful way.
I was very interested by the things you wrote about interactional expertise, which is this rather intangible business of being a scientist and knowing which other scientists you can trust. Do you get interactional expertise in Assyriology? Is there a kind of sense that somebody's gone a bit far over the edge and is
Yes,
pushing the boundaries?
We do. What happens is people move away from them.
Names.
People move away from them at conferences. I think the best solution here is the Babylonian one, where everybody lived their normal lives, had children, went to war and everything, and they had specialists. And they had specialists who were doctors, and specialists who were diviners, and specialists who advised the king, and they were experts. The very Babylonian term, umanu, is often translated as an expert. And they had their traditions, they had their literature, they had their transmitted knowledge, and to some extent they investigated things. And their roles were clearly delineated. So in a way, this is a pattern I find rather appealing.
We have Google, though, in addition, which is one of the problems, isn't it? That it is not inconceivable that somebody suffering from a disease may have the motive to make himself more of an expert in that disease than the GP who's never encountered it.
Yeah, that's the case, and it's incredibly dangerous. And one of the dangers was exhibited in South Africa when Thabo Mbeki decided not to distribute antiretroviral drugs to pregnant mothers. And his appeal to his parliamentarians was, read what's on the internet and you'll see there's a great argument going on here. But if you have a close look at who was writing on the internet, highly qualified scientists, Nobel Prize winners, but they'd passed their sell-by date. And that was only known within the oral community of the scientific profession. There was no way to tell this just by looking.
You needed the interactional expertise.
Talk. You needed the interactional expertise.
I think this question of quality control on the internet is a bit of a digression in this argument, but it's really a very important issue for the future.
It's not entirely a digression, because you've got a website that you're just setting up, aren't you? Which is one of the reasons you've come to talk to us, called Rethinking the Senses, and you're publishing papers.
Well, of course, that's absolutely right. I'm not talking about
impeccable, I'm saying.
Yeah, but it doesn't have the equivalent of peer review. I mean, we're hearing about when science can go wrong, and it goes wrong despite this curious system of self-regulation that science has developed called peer review, but there's none of that on the internet. So every opinion is out there, from the most respectable to the most haywire.
Tell us about Rethinking the Senses, because this is what you're interested in part is the way in which that old division of the five senses, taste and sight and hearing, it won't work anymore, will it? They all blur into each other and they all affect each other.
Indeed, that's absolutely true. The project that you're talking about is a major project which is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. It involves philosophers and scientists, experimental psychologists, neuroscientists, working together to try to think again about what are the principles of our perception of the world. This is, I think, just one example of what will be an increasing trend in the relationship between the humanities and the sciences, areas of interaction, of common interest, but different languages. We need this kind of Rosetta Stone for relations between science and the humanities. And I think this area of the senses is one that's ripe for proper discourse and discussion to take place. So it's this genuine interaction between philosophy and science to try and sort out what we mean by sensory experience, how we gain our impressions of the world, what it's for, whether it's just to entertain us or it's just to control our actions and our movement or our language or whatever. But you're right, it's the interaction between the senses, the discovery that what we hear influences what we see. Flavour is a wonderful example, the way in which taste and smell, of course, but also temperature and texture, and even what you see and hear about the things that you're eating and drinking influence the way it tastes to you.
There's also a more abstract sense in that your prejudice as you come to a new sense experience is going to have an enormous impact on how you actually see it, so that your brain is, to some extent, editing your perceptions and even changing them.
Well, yeah, obviously. I'm looking around this room. I haven't met any of you before. I will know you again when I next meet you. My brain will have responded, will have stored information about you, and that changes the way that I'll perceive you in the future. You will be familiar, and you weren't familiar in the past. The way in which our expectations and our previous experience, our learning at different stages in our lives affect what we actually see and hear, what we perceive of the world. It's an absolutely fascinating issue.
You've just been involved in a rather interesting kind of real-world example of this, which is this film, Tim's Vermeer,
yes,
about an American inventor, Tim Jennison, who was very taken with this notion that an optical device was used to make Vermeer, and he worked away at it. He works in optics himself, in computer-generated imagery. He worked away at it, and after 130 days of absolutely literally back-breaking labour, he produced essentially a photocopy.
Yes.
Isn't it? I mean...
yes, exactly. And it isn't just the 160 days or whatever of the painting of his simulation of that Vermeer, the music lesson, but the 5, 6, 7 years of thought and effort and exploration and reading and learning Dutch and so on that Tim had done to get to the point where he developed a device which might, I wouldn't say the claim's any greater than that, a set of optical components that allowed him, with no training in art at all, to produce something which is an incredibly good simulation of this extraordinary Vermeer, the sort of triumph of the Dutch Renaissance.
Part of the reason you're there is because you're talking about the ways in which one of his arguments is that the wash of light on the back wall of Vermeer's painting The Music Room is too perfectly graded. No human eye, as it were, could detect the exact breakdown of light across the wall. And you're sort of backing that up to a degree, that the eye isn't capable of doing that.
That's right. And the little trick that Tim invented, in a sense, solves that problem. The issue is that our eyes and our brains are information transmission and analysis systems, and they face all the kinds of problems that you do when you've got a poor phone signal or you're using a low bandwidth broadband connection or something. Noise, difficulty of interpretation increases. And the retina has a task of reducing the image from more than 1 million receptors in our eyes into a nerve which has only about 1 million or 1.5 million fibres. It has to do tricks to compress it.
So there's a bandwidth problem.
Yeah, and those tricks change the way that we see the world. And if an artist, there are lots of examples of this, were simply to paint what they see, there would be a strange paradox, because what the next viewer will be looking at would be the interpretation of the brain of the artist rather than the original scene.
Isn't there what they call the El Greco fallacy at work here? There's a famous example that, El Greco, if he really had astigmatism, he would have painted his canvases even narrower than they look. But if we can recognise the veracity of the wash of light on the back wall of a Vermeer, and that's the very reason that we think a Vermeer is great, surely we can detect those things and tell the difference between that and an improper painting,
well,
or a less perfect painting.
The renditions, absolutely, but to recreate it, it's extremely difficult when you view the whole scene at any one time. And the trick that Tim developed was to paint with a small chip of mirror, which not only gave him an accurate view of the scene that he was painting in a way that the camera obscura and poor quality lens systems and so on don't, but it also allowed him to see only a small fraction, and therefore was able to paint more accurately what the true brightness and colour of that point was, uninfluenced by all of these physiological, psychological effects from the surrounding scene.
He essentially turned himself into a human print head for a giant photocopy.
And not surprising, because that's his job.
This very point I wanted to raise. I'm going to try and shoot myself in the foot again by becoming an expert in your field. But you're shown in the documentary as saying he couldn't have painted that gradation of light because you can't see the difference. You can't see very slight differences in shade when they're far apart. But that seemed to me at the time to have a sort of fallacious ring to it, because, OK, you can't see the difference between that dark shade there and that very slightly less dark shade there, but that doesn't mean to say you can't see the gradation, because you're comparing all sorts of bits and you were made out as saying, yes, that proves it. And I wondered if you...
Not what you quite said to camera.
Yeah, but that's not how documentaries work, is it?
There are all kinds of illusions in which the eye is deceived in its perception of the gradient of brightness, local brightness differences being propagated through your perception in a way that doesn't match what your retina is actually receiving. The arguments are quite complicated, but I think the simple fact is that if artists painted literally what their brain has interpreted from a visual scene, then you'd be sort of looking at that rather than the original scene. And this applies equally to perspective, to the apparent size. One of the reasons that Philip Steadman, an expert on Vermeer, who also appears in the film, postulated that Vermeer used a camera obscura, a room in which he painted, is that his depictions of the relative size of people in his portrait scenes were unexpectedly like the real thing, that sizes differed according to distance in a way that we don't perceive. If you hold your hands up, do a simple experiment, hold your hands up, one twice as far away as the other, don't let them overlap each other, and ask yourself, how big those two hands look? Well, they look the same, of course, they're your hands, they look the same, but the image of one of them, quite obviously from the geometry, is twice as big as the other. It doesn't look twice as big, because your brain sort of corrects it and turns it into an internal representation of a hand rather than just of a retinal image. But the artist has to paint what's on their retina in order to simulate the reality to another person viewing that scene.
Colin, I'm really interested in what you say about how the brain has too much to cope with and sort of compresses it. Is it possible for you and your unique team of poets and scientists, so to speak, to analyse the compression process itself? Will that tell you anything? Whether the compression is one system or whether different sorts of stimuli merit different kinds of compression?
Well, I think we know quite a lot about the different sorts of tricks that are used both in the retina and in the brain to compress information. I mean, the retina does this pretty good job of translating a complex and detailed image into a small number of signals passing down the optic nerve, but the brain goes much further. Attention, for instance, is incredibly important. You only really see what you're attending to. That normally means what you're looking at directly. And the rest of what you see and feel of the world is to a large extent invented on the basis of your expectation or what you have just seen in the past as you pass your eye around the room. And I think science is telling us quite a lot about that. In a sense, philosophy has to come to terms with that, because there isn't a neat relationship between our perceptual experiences and the reality of the external world. Even the most physicalist philosopher must recognise that.
Hattie, Naylor, I'm going to turn to you, because your play in collaboration, Going Dark, is about the retina too, but a malfunction of the retina. It's essentially about a man who gives the commentary in a planetarium, and he suffers from retinosa pigmentosa. So he is slowly going blind. It's an extraordinary... I saw it when it was put on a while ago, and it's extraordinary in one sense because it does something that the theatre very rarely does, which is to plunge the audience into complete darkness. I mean, absolute. Yeah. No escape signs, no exit signs. It is completely dark. Very extraordinary thing to experience in the theatre.
That Sound and Fury, that's really their trademark, is taking you to pitch black basis. And the moment, of course, you put an audience into that, you suffer from sensory deprivation, and you listen to the sound. And we are fortunate, well, they are fortunate, I'd like to say we, but it's not we, they, Sound and Fury, are fortunate enough to have an extraordinary sound designer, composer with them called Dan Jones, who's one of the artistic directors, along with Mark Espiner and Tom Espiner. And Dan is an extraordinary composer and sound designer, and he encases the wall with sound and has devised new systems. There's a child in it which you never see, and because it's dark, you imagine that the child is there. His pre-recorded conversation with Tom's son Jack, which I'll talk about in a minute, and Dan has sort of put it together so you actually think the child is only. How high is that? That's four feet high,
yeah, roughly. And
he's and I don't know how you do that. That's and so you're completely immersed in this environment, and you experience it in a way that is completely submerged within the world.
When you were writing this play, I mean, you were partly writing it in collaboration, and there were the complicated ways in which the script came together. But when you were writing, did you know that you were writing for scenes that were pitch dark? Because you do see things in the play as well as it going dark. Did you have a different?
Yes, very early on we were in the planetarium, so we knew we had to keep it pitch black for that. And there's a fantastic moment when you see the canopy of the stars. So we knew that right from the beginning. And it isn't, there's a reason why clubs are dark, incredibly atmospheric. There's a reason why you go on dates in dim rooms, that's with one candle. There's
possibly
everything
more
that's
than
beautiful.
one explanation.
Yes, there is. That doesn't happen in the play. Jack Espiner, who's Tom's son. This is for me the most exciting part of the script, and forgive me, the rest of the team for saying that. But they recorded him at 6 and 7 asking about science, or they attempted to record him at 6 and 7, to ask questions about science. And Jack is a remarkable boy, and like his brother and his uncle, that has already a very brilliant mind, and he wouldn't ask the questions. He wouldn't ask them, and they spent hours and hours trying to record him, and he wouldn't ask them. Instead, he would tell, as any 5 or 6 or 7-year-old tells their dad, what he thought space was. He not only comes up with the big questions like, how does matter begin? We don't really know the answer to that, not really. And is space infinite? He also comes up with really potty ideas, like a Milky Way somewhere that's completely black. Like a spaceship that goes through the sun. And there's this this humorous moment right at the beginning of the play, which is sort of, which is heart-rendering, when he's telling his father off as saying that the sky is black. It's not black. It's very, very, very blue. And it's a gorgeous way to begin a play that is basically a play about science, where we are looking at astronomy.
What sense of responsibility do you have as a writer when you are popularising science and popularising cosmology in this case?
Well, I don't know if you'd call this. I mean, this is debatable. I don't know if you'd call this exactly popularist, in that it's this is a high art. They do high art end of theatre and extraordinary theatre. But the important thing about Max himself, the main character, is that he's a communicator of science. He's not a scientist, and we deliberately chose someone that wasn't a scientist because we knew we'd get caught out if we did, probably. But also because we wanted someone that could really communicate. And for me, going back to what we just said about the internet, what is really exciting about now, and I do a lot of youth work, and there are 2 extraordinary publications at the moment called Ex-Young Magazine and Younger Theatre. We're all written by people under 30. Because of the internet, they have access to this gigantic amount of information. And not knowing your stuff is, ignorance is evil as far as I'm concerned. But that information, it's all lots of rubbish, lots of stuff that's not right. But if you read enough, and if you know who you're reading on the internet, knowledge is for everybody.
Colin Blakemore, you've got a kind of wary expression on your face, I think I would characterise it.
Well, 2 issues there. And one, this final one about the reliability of the internet, but we've talked a bit about that. I don't think it's quite as simple as just getting a feel for what might be right or not. But the other is this question about science communication and who should do it. And there's a tension to some extent between scientists themselves, active practicing scientists, and we all know them. They're on the box, the Brian Coxes of this world and so on, telling us about
Yourself,
their science, trying
occasionally.
to explain what they do and why, and then extending their horizons to what other scientists are doing. And then there are the professionals who learn how to do it absolutely brilliantly, read well, the best of them, very knowledgeable about science. But there's a sort of lack of some sort of spark of authenticity. And this is not to criticise my many colleagues, friends who are experts in science communication, but I think we have to get right that relationship. The public are in the...
Where does the spark of inauthenticity come? Is that with the professional scientists or with the...
No, with science communicators.
With the science communicators,
science communicators are not directly involved in science. It's not that they're necessarily wrong, but I think you need the kind of label and the imprimatur of genuine science contributing to the debate and to the presentation of science. I mean, it's human nature to judge other people by how they feel and how they behave, by their body language and so on. The public like to see, as it were, real scientists, judge what scientists are like from seeing them in person. So I think it's an essential part of this kind of vista of science communication, which is terribly important these days, that scientists themselves should be involved in it.
But that old adage comes into play: every translation is a betrayal, isn't it? And that's part of the problem.
It seems to me that, in fact, science is rarely portrayed as it really is. I mean, Hattie's play, which is very, very great and enjoyable, but it's got a certain image of science. It's what I'd say, science is wonderful. I'm sitting in the studio holding my hands up and with my mouth open staring at the ceiling, which is pretending to be the stars, and it's what Brian Cox portrays, that image of science. And that's not the science that the public actually worries about when they're thinking about vaccination and next year's inflation rate and so on, which is all a terrible mess. And most science is a terrible mess. It's like trying to compress a balloon into a bag string,
I'm just going to bring Hattie Naylor. We're running out of time, but just very quickly, you're doing string theory. You've got about 30 seconds to answer.
Okay. So the problem about not having the information, and I think that science has never been as important as it is now. We could get by without knowing a lot of science until relatively recently. If people don't know what happens to a plastic bag, if they don't know about recycling, if they don't know those basic things, if they don't know about air travel, if they don't know about that impacting on the planet, which is basic, bog standard,
your 30 seconds are running out, I'm afraid.
Science, then we're sort of lost. So science has to. We have to have that information.
We need to go now. I'm sorry, you got to the end of your sentence. Thank you to all of my guests. Irving Finkel's The Ark Before Noah is out now, and you can see the tablet at the British Museum. Harry Colin's Are We All Scientific Experts Now will be published next month. Hattie Naylor's Going Dark, performed by Sand and Fury, is on at the Science Museum from the 5th of March, and you can find out if Tim's Vermeer, featuring Colin Blakemore, wins a BAFTA on Sunday. For now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
Never sink, it would just bob around safely with all the animals mooing and so forth inside until the water went down. Then it would land and they'd all just board and start breeding like crazy. You
have pictures of kind of relatively modern coracles. I mean, they've gone out of use on the Euphrates now, but
yes.
They can carry 15 to 20 people.
Yes, they don't look very happy in the photograph, but you can get a lot of people into a coracle.
Now, the interesting thing was you did some research on the mathematics of this, and they hadn't just come up with the numbers at random, just to make it really huge.
Exactly, because in a myth like this, you'd expect someone to say the biggest coracle ever seen and all that kind of thing. But what they actually did was to give the dimensions and the size, the area of the base of this coracle is about half the size of a football pitch. And the coracle was to be made out of coiled rope with wooden ribs inside and then bitumen all round it. And what's given here in the form of instruction from God to man is the quantity.
Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. If you've been thinking it might be a good idea to build an ark over the last few weeks, stay tuned. Irving Finkel of the British Museum has a set of instructions translated from a Babylonian clay tablet that predates Genesis by over 1,000 years. The good news, you won't need to find a source of gopher wood, but you are going to end up with the biggest coracle ever built. Also with us today is the writer Hattie Naylor, whose play Going Dark temporarily deprives the audience of eyesight so that they can better understand the experience of a man going blind. And the neuroscientist Professor Colin Blakemore, here to talk about the reliability of our senses and their unexpected interactions. As well as all that expertise, we have an expert on experts too, the sociologist Harry Collins, whose new book argues that we just don't take scientists seriously enough anymore. We're going to start, though, with a small clay tablet about the size of a mobile phone and covered with cuneiform writing. Irving Finkel, you very kindly brought in a
museum ever since. If you make a really good discovery, you at least get down to your underclothes.
You didn't take your clothes off and you're fully dressed now, but you do convey the excitement. Your book very charmingly keeps going into italics. You say that cuneiform is the most interesting kind of writing. It is much more fun than any alphabet.
When I was at school, people said you mustn't use italics. You're a poor writer if you do. You have nothing in the words that commands attention. Well, I've discovered, having reached the age of 62, that in point of fact, when people read English, they don't read intelligently. And if you put something in italics, they know that's the bit they have to make attention to. I think it's a useful device.
Well, I was very struck by you saying it was much more fun, because you talk about the difficulties of deciphering it. Interesting, yes. Challenging, yes. But fun, it is enormously difficult, isn't it? Just explain some of the difficulties.
It's only enormously difficult for about a decade. Once you're involved with it, once you feel where you are, you know the parameters of your world, it does become fun. What is fun in the real sense is, firstly, reading something that no one's read before, because that's always an adventure. And the other thing is finding something totally unexpected coming out of a tablet which looks like a normal tablet. And this was the most extreme case, because no one would have known how much marvellous stuff was concealed in those wedges.
Okay.
That's really good fun.
Well, tell us what you discovered.
Well,
the
really main thing is this, that the boat that was supposed to be built, the lifeboat to rescue the life on the earth before the waters, was a round craft. And people know what Noah's Ark looks like. It's a kind of little boat with a house in the middle, or in the Bible it's a kind of oblong vessel, and nobody, I don't think, had ever thought of the idea it might be round. But in this tablet it's very clear that the Babylonians in about 1750 BC, that's how they conceived of it. And it's a very rational thing, because they had these coracles, these normal round boats that you even find in the British Isles, on the rivers, the Euphrates and Tigris, as their normal taxi service. They were small and you could manoeuvre them quickly. And it makes sense that the poet who wrote this story, and accounting for the boat that was going to rescue everything, would build the biggest coracle ever made, which would...
Replica of this. To an untrained eye, it looks pretty much like any other Babylonian clay tablet. It is a closed book if you don't read cuneiform. When it was brought to you at the British Museum, you knew pretty quickly that it was something special. How did it come to you?
When I first saw it, I thought it was a letter, because it's a very conventional looking, fit in the hand kind of tablet in normal kind of writing, and I thought it was a letter. So I picked it up expecting to say, to Mr. So-and-so, and it started off, wall, read wall. And those words to an Assyriologist are a red rag to several bulls, because it's part of the most famous literature, the flood story, and it's the very moment when the god Enki in heaven tells Atrahasis, who's the equivalent of Noah, that he's got to build this boat, otherwise
it's a recognisable invocation to a famous story.
Absolutely.
In your book, The Ark Before Noah, which is all about this tablet and its implications, you write about an earlier keeper at the British Museum who was so excited when he got the Noah story. He took all of his clothes off immediately.
He did. I think there's been an expectation in the British